introduction, and thank you to all the participants for your interest in this topic. So, as Fernando mentioned, today we will speak about EU regional cooperation and specifically about the design of international auctions for renewables. And as we have a lot of content to discuss, I will just dive straight in. So what I want to do with you is first to give you a bit of background information, especially on the regulatory background and auctions in general. Then the main part will be designing international auctions, so the questions we have to deal with when we design international auctions. Then we will briefly go through a hypothetical case study between Portugal and a possible opened auction between Portugal and Belgium. And finally, I'll introduce to you some policy implications and recommendations which are not only for opened auctions, but for national auctions, so for renewables auctions in general. So, the background. Our regulatory background, I think, as most of you know, in June 2014, the European Commission, namely the DG Competition, published the General Block Exemption Regulation, the GBAR. And in this document, they published some criteria. If a support measure by a member state conforms to these criteria, the support measure can go through a simplified notification procedure to be recognized as justified state aid. If a support measure does not comply with these criteria, it has to go through the full lengthy procedure of notification, and there is a reasonable chance that it might also be rejected as unjustified state aid. Basically, the new state aid regulation very much encourages the implementation of competitive mechanisms in renewable support, and this has to be done by 2017. So competitive mechanisms, the most obvious thing, it will be implemented through auctions in most member states. So this means that the majority of European member states, those who don't have auctions implemented yet, are at the moment in some stage of planning auctions, of discussing possible auctions design or piloting, testing auction design. In addition to this, so auctions becoming a very hot topic in the EU at the moment, the Commission also explicitly encourages member states to open support schemes, so to open auctions and make better use of the cooperation mechanisms that are given under the Renewable Directive at the moment, but which at the moment aren't used very much. So at the moment in the EU, the most common way to support renewables is through feed-in premiums or feed-in tariffs, which are mostly administratively set. But we already have some experiences with auctions as well. So countries which have either in the past or currently the auction schemes running include Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, the UK and Spain. And outside the EU, some prominent examples include Brazil, California, China, and South Africa. As I said, the majority of member states are at some stage of auction preparation at the moment. Some examples for countries where we know that they are discussing some very concrete proposals, more or less concrete proposals at the moment are, for instance, Croatia, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. This list is not complete. If you want to know more information about this, I suggest that next to reading the report, this report about international auctions, you can also go to the orisproject.eu website. You will find case studies there on all of these countries that I've mentioned here. So, about auctions in general, auctions are a price-finding mechanism. So that means they are not a support instrument by themselves, but they can be combined with different price-based support instruments. So that means it could be a feed-in tariff, a feed-in premium, or an investment grant, for instance. And that means you have design elements on two levels. So you start by defining how do you want your support to look like as a policymaker. So, for example, do you want it to be a feed-in premium, feed-in tariff, or investment grant? Do you want it to last for 20 or 15 years, let's say? Do you want it to be technology specific or technology neutral? And then, do you want to set price levels administratively, which, as I said, was the more common form so far in the EU, or do you want to do it auction-based? And if you want to do it based on an auction, you get this whole new level of design elements here. So what do you want your actual auction mechanism to look like? And this can include a whole range of design elements. So it could be, for instance, a price only or a multi-criteria auction. It could be static or dynamic. You have to decide on your pricing rule, the way you'd want to design your penalties and your pre-qualifications, the regularity of auctions, ceiling prices, etc. Now today I'm not going to go through all of these design elements one by one. If you are interested, you can look at the report that I quoted as a source here. I will just go through some of the ones that are more challenging when you make an auction international. So I would like to make some comments on the support payment types. So as I said, you could combine an auction either with an investment grant, feed-in tariff, or feed-in premium. First of all, for an investment grant, they have these three support payment types have different benefits and drawbacks. If you choose to do an investment grant, that's to say your bidders bid for an investment grant that they will receive in the beginning, and then during the operation of the plant, they will have to sell their electricity on the market. If you choose to do that as a policymaker, it means the plant operators will be directly exposed to market signals during operation. So it can be a good thing to expose operators to market signals to a certain degree. However, when you are dealing with auctions, there is an additional complication that future market prices, which will be the only income source for the renewables plant in this case, are unsure. And when you include an unsure element like this into the calculation of the bidders in an auction, they will make estimates in order to be able to formulate their bids. Now you run the risk that the auction will award not the bidder which made the best estimate and actually has the lowest generation costs, but you will award those bidders that made the most optimistic estimate of future market price developments. And there is a risk that these optimistic market price development estimates may be too low, and that means these projects might actually be might not be commercially viable. This effect is called the winner's curse. So the winner's curse always occurs when you have significant unknown elements in the calculation of your bidders. In addition, investment grants for non-variable res, so for example for biomass, the market price alone might not be incentive enough to start operating because their fuel costs might be higher in some instances. So you might have to define a strike price above which the operator is required to start production. For variable res, in practice, there has been shown that there's a possible incentive for undesired plant designs. So if you get per capacity support, it means the bidders are incentivized to design plants with large capacities, which are not necessarily desirable from a system perspective. Secondly, feed-in tariffs. A feed-in tariff from an operator's point of view is the safest option there is no exposure to market signals, but feed-in tariffs are not encouraged under the state aid regulation. They would not comply with the general block exemption rules, and so we will not discuss feed-in tariffs any further in this presentation. Finally, feed-in premiums. Feed-in premiums are, for now, by far the most common type of support payment which is allocated by auctions in real-life applications. And depending on how you design a feed-in premium, it can lead to varying degrees of market signal exposure for the operator. The most prominent options of feed-in premiums are the sliding premium and the fixed premium. For a sliding premium, the support level is the difference between a predetermined remuneration level and the average market value of electricity from a given technology. So that's their reference price. And the difference between that remuneration level and this reference price is their support. There is less risk for the producer because he will always receive a predetermined remuneration level. The risk of future electricity price fluctuations is on the side of the regulator. The risk levels can vary and they depend on the averaging period of the reference price. If you make the averaging period very short, so maybe 1 hour for instance, then a sliding feed-in premium is very similar to a feed-in tariff. If you make the averaging period longer, let's say 1 to 3 months, there is more exposure to market risk because you're in competition to produce at times when electricity market prices are high, or when the market values for your technology at that moment are high. Cap and floor feed-in premium is in the middle risk-wise between a sliding and a fixed premium. And finally, it's also thinkable to have a feed-in premium as a percentage of the market price. This would deliver an even more exaggerated market risk exposure to the operator. This leads to very high risks from the side of the operator, so we would not recommend this. So in total, looking at all of these three support payment types, what we think is the best, the most recommendable support payment type for most cases is a sliding feed-in premium with a reasonably long averaging period. So it should be around 1 to 3 months. So there is some exposure to market signals for the operators. Well, regarding to the benefits of international auctions, so why do we even want international auctions? I think for those of you who already followed previous discussions on support scheme harmonization, these arguments will look very familiar to you. We've had long discussions about harmonizing support schemes European-wide, especially the last hot discussion was in 2007, 2008, so that was just before the current Renewables Directive came into effect in 2009. And basically we see the same arguments as previously in favor of harmonization here again. So open auctions would make more use of best sites, so it means we would use the good sites, the lowest cost sites across Europe, and this would lead to higher static efficiency in the sense of reduced generation costs. Also, it will be more compatible with the EU internal market and the free movement of goods. In addition, you can argue that international auctions are based on an international agreement between at least 2 member states, so they may be less prone to retroactive changes because retroactive changes have been a problem previously in existing support schemes for renewables. But of course, international auctions also come with their challenges. And again, I think if you've followed previous harmonization discussions, you will find these very familiar. So with any support scheme that makes use of best sites, you run the risk of creating hotspots, so areas with a very high density of renewables installations, and these will require grid expansions and reinforcements, and will also lower electricity market prices of other producers in the same market zone. You also run the risk of public acceptability issues if you get very high densities of renewables. And then there's the problem of coexistence with national support schemes. So if you have international support schemes coexisting with those, you should, as a policymaker, take care not to undermine these. In addition, there might be a problem with permitting procedures not aligned. So if you have projects from two different countries competing in the same auction, and you ask them to provide pre-qualification papers such as permits, building permits, and environmental permits, they have to be at least to some degree comparable to make the project comparable. Access to finance is also not the same. Cost of capital and typical debt to equity ratios of projects in different countries differ. This is especially relevant for smaller actors. And electricity market prices differ as well, at least as long as markets are not yet fully coupled. Okay, so let's proceed to designing international auctions. So as Fernando mentioned in his introduction, basically we see two basic types of international auctions. So the one is an open auction, where member state A holds its own nationally organized auction, but opens this national auctions to installations which are situated in member state B. So it could either open part of the target capacity or the whole target capacity. In theory, it's possible that this could be done unilaterally, but from a political perspective, we think it's much more likely that member states will agree to do this reciprocally. So we call this reciprocally opened auction. Then the other option are common auctions. In this case, member states A and B would hold an auction together. So that means all auction design elements are actually commonly determined by these two member states. Such a common auction may be held in addition to national auctions, especially in the short and medium term, or it might also completely replace them, probably only in the longer term. So I would like to go through the following list of auction design elements with you. About setting the target volume. When you set the target volume in an opened auction, as I mentioned before, you have to be careful not to, as a policymaker, not to undermine any existing national auctions that you might have. So you need to adjust your auction volumes in all the auctions accordingly, because competition will be influenced by all the ongoing auctions, and parallel auctions may draw competition from each other, which could lead to higher prices if the policymaker isn't careful here. Secondly, support expenditures, support type, and the reference electricity price. I would like to have a bit of a closer look at this graph here with you. Let's say we are assuming, as I mentioned before, a sliding feed-in premium. So we are assuming here that we have an auction with two member states. The total volume of the auction is 100 megawatts. For the sake of simplicity, we say that this corresponds to 100 gigawatt hours of annual electricity production. Country A has levelized cost of 100 euro per megawatt hour, so we assume that the project will also bid at 100 euros, and country B has lower LCOE of only 80 euro per megawatt hour. So that means in an opened auction, if you open the whole volume, all installations would go to country B. we assume that under this sliding premium, the reference electricity price is that of the country in which the installations are located. So installations in country B use the electricity price of country B, and for A, it's the electricity price of country. So what does that mean in different cases? Let's look at one case where, for instance, you have the LCOE here in blue of 100 in country A. You have an electricity market value of 60. So this would result in a support level under a sliding premium of 40. In country B, you have LCOE of 80. You have a market value of 50. So the difference, that would be the support payment, would be 30 in this example. So what does that mean for support expenditures? The volumes in country A, as I said, nothing got built in country A, so it's 0 megawatts there, which means support expenditures of 0. For country B, it's 100 megawatts there, so support expenditures would be 3 million euros in this case. Now let's consider another scenario, maybe a different year, where in country A it's exactly the same. The electricity price is again at 60, leading to a support level of 40. But in country B, we see the electricity price is lower this time. It's only at 30. So this means suddenly we have a support level of 50. So what happens to our support payments? In country A, again, as we built nothing there, it means they have support expenditures of 0. But in country B, these 100 megawatts suddenly cost support expenditures of 5 million euros per year. So I think so far this is pretty obvious. In a sliding premium, the electricity price has a significant impact on the support level, and this risk is borne by the regulator. This is obvious, and it also applies to national auctions. But please keep this picture in mind, because we will come back to this later. If you don't want to use the domestic electricity price as the reference electricity price, you have some alternatives as well. The regulator could say that we choose a different reference price. For example, we choose a reference price is always the one of country A, always the one of country B, or maybe a weighted average of the two electricity prices. Or you can also say, okay, we don't do a sliding feed-in premium, we do a fixed, and then we don't have to bother with setting electricity prices at all. Okay, this is just to keep in mind for later. Then to continue with our list, so regarding effort sharing and the payment mechanism, this is to be negotiated, so it has to be negotiated which member states takes how much electricity to count towards his targets. It could be 50-50, could be any other distribution. And then do you actually bear the costs also in the same ratio? That would be the simplest option, but there might also be some room for negotiation, because member states might have different indirect costs and benefits, or might have different willingness to pay depending on their opportunity costs. Like, what would their costs be if they just stuck with a national auction? So this is a matter of negotiation between the participating member states. The necessity of physical import of non-domestic resi, we don't think that in the short term it is necessary to have physical import. For the participating member states, statistical transfer is enough. But maybe it is politically more acceptable to actually tie it to physical import. In the long run, it's a bit different. In the long run, grid expansion has to keep up with renewables deployment. With regard to pre-qualification requirements, as I mentioned before, the licenses and permits have to be comparable, and the same applies, for instance, to site eligibility. So, for example, some countries may have restrictions for not having not having RES installations to be situated on agricultural land, for instance. So this has to be agreed upon between the two participating member states to have this comparable as well. Location specific, if you want to steer geographical contributions, this is actually a point member states, if you want to purely maximize efficiency, you just see where costs are lowest and then the projects are just built there. But you may want to steer geographic distribution, for example, to prevent everything from being built in one place, to prevent such hotspots and the problems with public acceptability that come with it. You could do that, for instance, by introducing contingents for minimum contingents for the slightly more expensive regions, or boni for certain regions that you find desirable. The same is true also for other secondary objectives. So, for example, if you want to favor certain actor types, or you want to promote your local industry or something like that, it can be introduced in an auction. Finally, coordination of grid plans with renewables deployment. Deployment becomes more difficult to predict if it's spread across two different countries, and you can't predict so easily where projects will be built. Could be take place in either member state, so these participating member states also need to coordinate their grid planning if they build significant amounts of renewables in common auctions or in international auctions. Okay, so far we were speaking about international auctions in general. Now I would like to move on. As, if you remember, I introduced these two different types of auctions to you 10 minutes ago. One was reciprocally opened, the other one was common auctions. So now we will have a closer look at the reciprocally opened auction. About setting the target volume. If member state A, for instance, designs a national auction and decides to open it to installations from member states B, this will probably increase competition in A's auction, but it may also decrease competition in a national auction that might be running in member state B. So it's an important matter of negotiation between these two member states, how much capacity they want to open to each other in order not to destroy each other's competition levels in national auctions. Then, with regard to support expenditures and support types and the reference electricity price, we go back to this graph that I showed you before. So we have the same cases. You remember we were looking at, so this time we are looking at two member states, and it's a reciprocally opened auction. So in this case, country A opens an auction to installations from country B. Total volume is again 100 megawatts. Country A has again LCOE of 100, country B of only 80, so it means everything is built in country B. The reference electricity price is again country in which the installation is located. Now, as previously in our case 1, this means if you compare it, first of all, if you compare it to a national auction, what would happen if country A just built the 100 megawatts at home? There would be, as the support level is 40 euro per megawatt, so there would be total support expenditures of 4 million euro for country A. Now, since they are doing an opened auction, what happens is that nothing is built in country A, so support expenditures caused in country A are 0 euros. Everything is built in country B, so support expenditures are 3 million euros. So in this case, that's nice because country A has to pay these 3 million euros, but they saved 1 million in comparison to having done the same thing in a national auction. So it's a decrease in support expenditures for country A, and it's increased deployment and local benefits and investments for country B. So it's pretty good for everybody. In case 2, again, in a national auction, country A would have paid 4 million euros, but in this case, since the electricity price is lower in country B and there's a support level of 50 euros, this results in total support expenditures of 5 million euro in country B. So this means country A has to pay these 5 million euros, and that's higher than the 4 million they would have had to pay, even though generation costs are higher in their own country. But support expenditures turned out to be higher building it in the lower cost country. Still, there is some benefit for country B because they enjoy local benefits and investments. So again, alternatives for the reference price. If you don't, how do you deal with this risk? Somebody has to always bear this risk of future price developments. You could use the electricity price in country A, which is, however, risky for the regulator and risky for the plant operator as well if his plant is actually located in country B, where he is actually selling his electricity, but then his support depends on an electricity price in country A, which has nothing to do with his reality. That is very risky and will lead to estimates in future income stream, which again will lead to this winner's curse that I mentioned before. So we definitely would not recommend this option. We might decide to use an average price of A and B. That's a more balanced risk. And one main unproductive risk which remains is that markets cannot successfully be coupled because of a lack of interconnectors. Another option could be to use a fixed feed-in premium. With the drawbacks that I mentioned before, it also brings along some risk of winners. So these risks need to be balanced against each other. Well, and finally, with regard to effort sharing and payment mechanisms, so it's comparatively clear in this case what the effort sharing should look like, because each member state pays the support for which it opened the capacities in its own auctions. There might be questions about compensation because, for instance, in our previous example, country B had a lot of indirect benefits through local investments, but it might also have indirect costs, for example, because grid expansions become necessary. So depending on the evaluations of these two effects, compensation payments could be possible in either direction and are a matter of negotiation. Each country should be, if the country opens similar volumes to the other reciprocally, it did strongly, such as in our example that review. Okay, and then next, I would like to move on to commonly held auctions. Again, we go through the same three factors. So setting the target volume. Yeah, basically what I said before, if it's in parallel to national auctions, auction volumes must be adjusted to each other. If you make a large common auction, you draw competition away from any national auctions you might have at the same time. So you must, as a regulator, reduce your auction volumes accordingly in order not to end up with too high prices. With regard to support expenditures and support types and the reference electricity price, again, we have the same example. So again, our two member states, this time they hold a common auction. It's again 100 megawatts, again the same LCOE of 180. This time we assume that the two countries decide they want to share the auction with an 80 to 20 ratio. So country A decides they want to use 80% of the used electricity of the generated electricity towards their target, and country B only wants to use 20%, maybe because they already have a very high renewable share. Again, the reference electricity price is the country in which the installation is located. So, if this was a national auction, if it was two national auctions, one in country A and one in country B, then country A would do 80% of 100 megawatts, that's 80 megawatts on its own ground, which would result in support expenditures of 3.2 million. And country B would do 20 megawatts, which would result in 0.6 million. Now they're doing an international auction. Again, this results in 0 megawatts built and 0 support expenditures in country A, and 100 megawatts built in country B, which results in support expenditures of 3 million euro. Now, if we divide this up in a 80 to 20 ratio, then country A has to pay 2.4 million and country B has to pay 0.6 million. So this means for country A, they are happy about their decreased support expenditures. For country B, they have increased deployment and indirect benefits, and they have the same support expenditures as if they had done it nationally. Now in our second case, with the lower electricity prices in country B, again, if it was a national auction, it would result in 3.2 million and 1 million support expenditures each. If it's in an international auction, country A faces 0 support expenditures. In country B, the support expenditures are higher. They are at 5 million. Now if we divide these up, 80 to 20, we end up with 4 million and 1 million for each country. That means for country A, there's no local benefits from deployment and increased support expenditures, and for country B, increased deployment and indirect, the resulting indirect benefits. So what are the alternatives, again, that the policymaker has if he doesn't want to use the domestic electricity price? In this case, it makes no sense to use either the electricity price in country A or the electricity price in country B for all installations. It's not a meaningful option in this case. It would be possible to use an average electricity price of both countries, which would result in a more balanced risk. Again, the main unproductive risk is the lack of interconnectors, or policymakers may decide to revert to a fixed premium to avoid this risk, but in turn, again, this will incur other risks, so these risks must always be balanced against each other. And finally, with regard to effort sharing and the payment mechanisms, this is very similar again. It's less clear than in the previous, in the reciprocally opened auctions, because first the countries have to agree on how to split up the resulting electricity between them. So in the previous example, they agreed on an 80-20 distribution. You could do any distribution that you like if you participate as a country. But will they share the cost burden in the same way? The easiest would be to just share costs 80-20 as well. But because of indirect costs and benefits, either country may argue that they want to pay less. And because of the willingness to pay, either country may be more or less willing to pay the price that results from the auction if they assume that a national auction would result in a higher or lower price. So finally, I'd like to go through this assessment summary with you. So with regard to reciprocally opened auctions, the required degree of coordination is relatively high in an open auction because participating member states need to agree to open the auctions reciprocally and need to, the design elements with which they affect the other party need to be agreed upon. On the other hand, it's even very high in a commonly held auction because participating member states actually need to agree on really all of the design elements together to design the auction together. With regard to effort sharing, in an open auction this is more clear because each member state just pays the support allocated in its national auction because it's its own national auction which is open for the outside. There is a potential question of sharing indirect costs and benefits, which might be a problem of negotiation. There is more potential for negotiation in a commonly held auction because member states first need to agree on the contribution of target volumes, and then this might be shared accordingly, or depending on the willingness to pay. And in case of sliding premiums, some additional complications are possible depending on different market prices. Regarding scalability, scalability in open auctions is potentially complex, so mutual agreements between two countries cannot easily be joined by third countries. Basically, there has to be a bilateral agreement between all countries that want to open their auctions with each other. So this means it would be a multitude of bilateral agreements. In contrast, the scalability of common auctions is quite good because more member states could just join an existing common auction, and this could be scaled up quite easily. The complexity for international investors is rather high for open auctions because it's bilateral agreements which are different each time, while in commonly held auctions it's moderate. At least the more member states join a cluster with one type of common auction, the less complex it becomes for investors who just need to familiarize themselves with this one type of auction. Now, finally, the policy risks are slightly reduced in an open auction because you could argue that it's based on an international agreement, and so policy risks may be reduced, especially of individual countries. But this effect, we assume this effect is a bit stronger in commonly held auctions because this is also an international agreement, and especially in cluster constellations which combine low risk and high risk countries, the financing risk will be averaged, and therefore countries with good potentials and higher risks will profit from this. Okay, finally, before we get to the policy implications and recommendations, I want to go through the case study with you. So we did a hypothetical case study. I would like to emphasize it's hypothetical. It doesn't reflect the actual positions of Portugal or Belgium. Portugal and Belgium were chosen because, as you see in this map, Portugal has rather low-cost PV potentials, so we decided to make a case around large-scale PV installations between these two countries. So Portugal has low-cost PV potentials, has clearly expressed interest in cooperation previously, and currently has no financial support for large-scale PV. Belgium, on the other hand, has rather high-cost PV potentials, so it might be beneficial for Belgium if it wants to reach its renewable target to build PV in Portugal rather than build high-cost installations on in its own country, for example, offshore wind. Large PV is supported at the moment under the regional quota scheme. So Belgium at the moment has a quota scheme, so it's not under the same political pressure as many other countries to introduce auctions. But for this purpose, we assume that it's conceivable that Belgium in the medium term may be willing to introduce auctions. One major barrier we see here in this case study is the lack of interconnectors between Spain and France. So as renewables shares rise, it becomes increasingly difficult to get electricity out of the Iberian Peninsula. So the objectives of the scheme, we assume it would be definitely efficient support allocation, but also that they would agree on geographical steering using contingents. We would suggest the 100 megawatts in the first year to be scaled up to 300 to 400 megawatts per year later. Project sizes could range from 100 kilowatts to 10 megawatts. Ceiling prices, we say a meaningful number is 10% above LCOE. So according to our LCOE estimate, that would result in a ceiling price of 60.5 euro per megawatt around in 2020 for the auction in general, with a higher ceiling price for a minimum contingent in Belgium. So something gets also built in Belgium, that would be for 99 euro per megawatt. Effort sharing, in this case, we just assume that the two countries would agree on a 70 to 30 ratio of dividing the reduced electricity between them, and then the effort sharing has to be negotiated between the two countries. So indirect costs and benefits would be mainly situated in Portugal because most gets built in Portugal, so there's some additional system costs, some benefits such as labor market, local investments, and depending on the valuation of those, competition may be requested by either Portugal or Belgium. Then secondly, the willingness to pay. For Belgium, this would be equal to the level that they would need to pay for domestic low-cost installations in their own country, so possibly onshore wind. For Portugal, this would be equal to support level that would result if they just did a national large-scale PV auctions, which might be lower than if they share their low-cost potentials with Belgium. So this is a clause of something to be negotiated. Finally, the periodicity, we think it should be a long-term and predictable plan with 2 to 3 auction rounds per year. We recommend a sliding feed-in premium with a reference price 3 months with a 3-month weighted average of Portugal and Belgian prices. Multiple item auctions for a technology like large-scale PV for which project sizes are still rather small. We also recommend a static format for this. Regarding the pricing rule, the pricing rule doesn't make such a big difference as has been shown in the German auction experience, but we recommend to start with a pay-as-bid as this seems to be easier for participants, but later alternate with uniform pricing. Then regarding pre-qualifications, we recommend 2-step bid bonds and to ask for grid access and construction permits, of course. So, and finally, I would like to get to some policy implications and recommendations. As I said before, these are more general. These are also very similar to recommendations that we gave to the Commission developed in the AURES project. So again, look for forthcoming publications also on the auresproject.eu website if you're interested in more details on that after you read the report which is connected to this webinar. So we think, so these recommendations are especially because the discussion about the second Renewable Energy Directive is ongoing. So these are especially connected to how auctions should be addressed in RED 2, the second directive that is upcoming. So we think that RED 2 may recommend sliding feed-in premiums, but in general, member states should be free to decide which support type they want to choose. Support should definitely discourage production as soon as the market prices become lower than the negative value of support. Secondly, member states should be free to implement technology neutral or technology clustered or technology specific. Member states should also be free to give favorable treatment to certain actor groups or to immature technologies. If a member state can prove that auctions are not the best measure for a specific market or for a specific technology, if it can prove that with ex ante studies, then it should be possible for a member state to have alternative support measures. Member states should be allowed to apply secondary objectives in their auction schemes, so if they're well justified and if cost efficiency, of course, cost efficiency always has to remain the main objective. Auction rules should be flexibly adaptable by member states. So RED 2 should give some guidance on certain design elements, such as, for example, ceiling prices and auction periodicity. Definitely it should require member states to include penalties and pre-qualifications, but it shouldn't exactly prescribe how to do it. That should be free for member states. RED should not prescribe the time and degree of opening of auctions either. It should provide a description of options, but it should not force member states to open auctions prematurely. Member states need to be free to keep auctions national in the short term. RED 2 should require member states to take measures which enable stakeholders to participate in the design of auctions and to also have easy access to auctions once they are finished with the design. So that's especially the case for small stakeholders, for example, for which transaction costs can be prohibitive or understanding the auction can be prohibitive. And finally, RED 2 should also include a clause which forbids retroactive change. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to receive your questions in the 5 minutes that are still left. Thank you.
Okay,